Movies made medieval knights look like spotless heroes in shiny armor, riding into perfect one-on-one duels with a code of honor that never breaks. The real knights of medieval Europe were something else. A small, expensive military class built on land, contracts, and politics. Their armor was practical engineering, not a magic shield. Their weapons and tactics were chosen for survival, not style. And most medieval wars weren't decided by dramatic open-field battles at all, but by sieges, raids, supply problems, and hard choices that had nothing to do with romance. Once you look past the Hollywood knight, you start seeing what they actually were. Trained professionals in a brutal, complicated system where money, horses, and logistics often mattered more than courage. Number 1. Knights were a social class. A movie knight usually looks like a solo superhero. One guy, one sword, one horse, and a clean moral code. In real medieval Europe, knight was first of all a place in the social ladder, and only second a fighting style. A knight was part of the land-holding warrior class, tied to a lord, a family network, and a set of obligations that could be legal, financial, and political. That's why two armored fighters on the same battlefield might not be equal in status. Plenty of men fought like knights without being knights. You'll see the term men-at-arms for heavily equipped professional fighters, and many of them were not formally knighted. On the flip side, some knights weren't wealthy or famous at all. A lot of them were minor gentry, trying to keep up appearances while staying solvent. Another movie shortcut is the idea that knights were everywhere, like the default medieval soldier. They weren't. Most armies were built from a mix, some elite mounted fighters, some trained infantry, lots of less protected troops, plus specialists like archers or crossbowmen depending on region and century. Knights mattered, but they were a small slice of the total force. Even their main value wasn't always charging and winning. Often it was leadership, discipline, and serving as the hard core of a retinue, meaning a group of fighters attached to a lord. And knights didn't just magically appear on the battlefield. Someone had to pay for their horses, gear, travel, food, helpers, and replacements. That money came from land income, war wages, loans, or a mix of all three. So when you see a shining knight in a story, the real question behind him is, who's funding this? Who's backing him? And what does he owe in return? Once you look at knights as a social role, not a costume, the next myth falls apart fast. The idea that becoming a knight was just a quick ceremony and a cool title. Number 2. Training was brutally practical. The popular version is a young noble who learns a couple of sword moves, gets dubbed with a blade, and suddenly he's ready to fight. Real training was long and mostly unglamorous. Boys placed in noble households started as pages, basically junior servants learning how a military household runs. That meant discipline, riding basics, handling animals, carrying messages, learning etiquette, and watching older fighters up close. Later, as squires, they were doing hands-on work that mattered, managing tack and horses, keeping weapons in working condition, helping a knight dress in armor, and learning how to stay calm around violence without freezing. Weapon practice was real, but it wasn't just fencing in a courtyard. A medieval fighter needed control from horseback, stamina under stress, and the ability to wrestle, shove, and stay balanced when everything got chaotic. Riding itself was a skill that took years. A warhorse wasn't a motorcycle you hop on and go. It had to be trained to tolerate noise, crowds, sudden movement, and impact. If a horse panics, the rider's skill doesn't matter. That's another thing movies rarely show. A lot of knightly skill was animal handling. There's also the mental side. Knights had to navigate oaths, loyalties, and reputation. Some needed basic literacy for contracts, letters, and accounts, especially later in the Middle Ages when military service was often arranged with written agreements. They also had to understand the local power structure because war was politics with weapons. And when training finally turned into real war experience, the biggest lesson wasn't style, it was survival. Conserve energy, keep formation, protect your horse, don't get isolated, don't chase glory into a trap, and don't assume your armor makes you safe. Which brings us to the most misunderstood part of the knight's image. armor. Not as movie fashion, but as working equipment with real limits. Number 3, armor was a system, not a metal shell. Movies bounce between two extremes: armor as an invincible cheat code, or armor as a stiff tin can where the wearer can't breathe. Real armor was closer to engineered sports gear, just made with medieval materials and methods. It evolved over centuries because threats changed. Mail was excellent against cuts, especially when worn over padding that absorbed force and reduced injury. Later, as more weapons focused on punching through protection or delivering heavy impact, armor added plates and eventually full plate harness for those who could afford it. Good plate was shaped to deflect hits, and it was fitted to the body with straps and points so it moved with you. A fully armored fighter could run, kneel, climb, and mount a horse, because if you can't move, you're done. The price was heat, fatigue, and the constant need for maintenance. Straps break. Rivets loosen. Leather stretches in rain. Metal rusts. That's why knights traveled with helpers and spare parts. Another movie lie is that knights lived inside armor all day. On campaign, a lot of time was spent marching, waiting, guarding, and dealing with weather. Full harness was for the moment you expected serious contact. Sometimes you wore lighter protection, sometimes you wore key pieces, sometimes you kept armor close but not on your body. And helmets especially were not worn non-stop because visibility and breathing matter when you're not actively fighting. Also, armor includes what's under the metal. Padded garments, linen layers, and fitted arming clothes were doing a lot of work to prevent chafing and to manage impact. Without that, metal armor is painful and distracting fast. Now here's the part that really breaks the movie version. Once plate armor became common among elites, the classic idea of a clean sword duel makes less and less sense. If someone is well protected, you don't win by swinging harder. You win by using the right tools and the right methods. Number 4. Swords were not the main tool. The sword is the symbol because it looks good and it's easy to recognize, but on real battlefields, it wasn't always the top weapon. For mounted knights, the main shock weapon was often the lance. A controlled charge with a couched lance could deliver massive force, and it wasn't about spinning around doing trick moves. It was about staying aligned with your group, keeping speed and balance, and hitting hard without losing control. Once things closed up, plenty of knights preferred weapons designed to deal with armor: maces, axes, warhammers, and especially pole weapons like the poleaxe in later periods. Those tools could concentrate force, hook, shove, and break structure. Even swords changed role. Against plate, the common approach was to thrust into gaps or use the sword as a lever and a control tool. You see techniques like half-swording, where a gloved hand grips part of the blade to guide the point accurately. You also see a lot of grappling. Not cinematic wrestling for drama, but practical clinching to off-balance someone, to drive them to the ground, to open a visor, or to force a surrender. Daggers mattered here too, because in very close contact, you want something compact and precise. Movies also love the idea of single combat deciding everything, but battlefield reality was teamwork and pressure. You tried to avoid being surrounded, you relied on comrades, and you fought in messy conditions: mud, uneven ground, smoke, noise, and sudden movement. Even hero moments were usually built on support. A knight who charges alone is more likely to be captured than celebrated. So if swords weren't the constant center of warfare, what was? A lot of medieval fighting was about taking and holding places, and about forcing decisions without risking everything in one big clash. That's why the most common knight experience in war often happened at a wall, not in an open field duel. Number 5. Most war was sieges and pressure. Big set-piece battles are rare compared to how often medieval wars dragged on through sieges, raids, and maneuver. If you control a fortified town, a bridge, a mountain pass, or a castle that dominates a road, you control movement and money. That's real power. So wars were often about strong points, not about two armies politely meeting on a flat field. A siege was slow, technical, and exhausting. You built earthworks, cut off routes, guarded supply lines, tried to control water and food, and looked for weak points. Sometimes you used siege engines, sometimes mining and countermining, Sometimes you just waited and negotiated while disease and hunger did the work. That last part is uncomfortable, but important. The most dangerous enemy in many campaigns wasn't a sword. It was sickness, poor water, and exhaustion. Another major strategy was raiding, not as random chaos, but as a way to break the enemy's economy and morale. Destroy crops, burn supplies, take livestock, and suddenly the enemy has trouble feeding garrisons and paying troops. This kind of pressure could force a surrender without a risky battle. It also explains why civilians suffered so much in medieval wars, even when commanders claimed to follow rules. Once an army is hungry and far from home, it becomes a moving demand for food and shelter. And because long, reliable supply chains were hard to maintain, armies often lived off the land, whether locals liked it or not. This is where the movie picture of honorable warfare hits a wall. Even when knights tried to act with restraint, the system pushed toward harsh methods. And when a battle did happen, it was often because someone had no better choice. An army trapped, a siege that had to be relieved, a political gamble, or a breakdown in negotiation. Which leads straight into the biggest myth people repeat without thinking: chivalry. Not because chivalry was fake, but because it didn't work the way the modern imagination wants it to work. Number 6. Chivalry was selective and strategic. Chivalry is often presented like a universal code that made knights morally better than everyone else. In reality, it was an ideal, a reputation tool, and sometimes a form of social control. Medieval society had a serious problem. A class of armed men with horses and training can easily become a threat to the people they're supposed to protect. So chivalric culture, along with religious pressure and royal law, tried to shape knightly behavior into something predictable. Loyalty to your lord, keeping oaths, showing courage, and respecting certain boundaries. But those boundaries were not evenly applied. A lot of chivalric good behavior was focused on interactions between elites. Capturing a noble enemy could be more valuable than killing him because ransom was part of the war economy. Treating high-status prisoners decently wasn't always kindness. It was smart business, and it protected your own class if the situation reversed later. That's why you see customs like parole and negotiated release among nobles in some contexts. Meanwhile, common soldiers and civilians often didn't receive the same protection. The gap between the chivalric ideal and actual behavior could be huge, especially during long campaigns, raids, and civil conflicts where hatred and revenge ran high. Another movie mix-up is blending courtly romance literature with everyday knight life. Stories about perfect love and perfect honor were popular, but they were also entertainment and propaganda for elite values. They don't automatically describe what knights did on campaign, or how they treated people when money and fear took over. Real chivalry was often about status, looking brave, being seen in the right circles, giving gifts, sponsoring churches, paying for good equipment, and avoiding public shame. Reputation could decide marriage prospects, alliances, and future employment in war. So the honor wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. And that practical side is exactly why knights were not non-stop fighters. In between wars, most of their time was spent not in tournaments, not in duels, but in management, law, and survival inside a high-pressure economy where a single bad year could wreck a family. Number 7. A knight's real life was paperwork, debt, and risk. The movie version shows knights living in castles, eating feasts, and waiting for quests. The real life for many knights was closer to being a heavily armed land manager who occasionally went to war. A lot of knights lived in manor houses, not fairy tale fortresses. Castles were important, but they were also expensive, and not every knight owned one. Day-to-day status came from land income, rents, local courts, and relationships with bigger powers. Knights handled disputes over boundaries, inheritance, marriages, and obligations. They served as local officials, witnesses, and enforcers. They had to keep a household running, which meant staff, storage, horses, repairs, and constant planning. War could look like a path to glory, but it could also be a financial trap. Maintaining the look of a proper knight was costly, and equipment wears out. Horses die. Armor needs repairs. Travel drains money fast. Many knights borrowed, mortgaged land, or relied on patrons. And then there's capture. For elites, capture could mean a ransom that emptied your estate for years. Even if you survived, your family might be selling land to get you back. That's why knights cared so much about networks and reputation. You needed people who would negotiate for you, vouch for you, lend money, or pressure the right lord. You also needed a reason for others to take you alive. On the battlefield, that could shape behavior in a very cold way. Add the constant reality that medieval politics was unstable, loyalties shifted, and yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's enemy, and you start to see the knight for what he really was. Not a clean symbol, but a professional warrior tied to an economic system, trained for violence, dependent on animals and equipment, and forced to balance courage with calculation every time he put on armor, stepped into a saddle, and tried to stay valuable enough to survive the next decision.